Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Chief Smith and Chief Chappell. Let me just say a few words to summarize some of the themes we heard this morning. Dorn of Global Container Terminal started us off by asking the very relevant question: what does sustainability really mean, having regard to people, purpose, and community impact? And he made a very strong case just around how vast it actually is, as we heard from the last conversation, around reconciliation and what that means relative to project development and engagement, through to strong, thriving communities. And obviously, it doesn't happen without meaningfully engaging people. And that really started the conversation around how to be purposeful around sustainability. And then over to Dave McLeod of Thought Exchange, who made a compelling case that true engagement occurs when you're able to reach a large number of people and provide them with a mechanism to express themselves unconstrained and without undue influence. And as a leader, we often find that we're constrained in our feedback loops. In other words, the people with whom we're speaking and get feedback from, we don't really get a true unbiased view of the information in our decision-making. We heard that as a theme all the way through today. And obviously for businesses, it's not only about inspiring employees, but today, as we heard, it's about retention in this hybrid work environment. Our employees are one Zoom window away from leaving our organizations, and so incredibly important to connect. It is true of internal corporate decisions, but it's even more true when trying to understand the true needs and desires of a community or a First Nation. Real engagement means genuinely being interested in what people think and believe, and clearly it is not transactional. We heard that in both of our panels. And we heard this theme around relationship and the relationship around process and ownership capital. And you heard this from the chiefs just a little bit earlier, and you heard it from Dave earlier as well. And it isn't just about engaging, and words matter here. Each community is unique. And stakeholders is probably the wrong way to describe some of these groups, and in particular, First Nations. We want to aim to unify by seeking input. And of course, there's an app for that, thoughtexchange.com. Turning to the first panel that Dave sat on, but also Jay Schlosser from Tech and Steve Vanegas from TransLink, moderated by Heather Owen of Leger. And, first, I think we need to all remember that as British Columbians, our prosperity is underpinned by the development of projects and infrastructure and the movement of goods and people. And it won't be lost on anyone that community engagement is a key success factor. In other words, many projects don't get up, never see the light of day for failure to take into account the needs and wants of communities rather. And at the end of the day, without significant community support, the project just doesn't get out. And as Jay points out, it's about the one-on-one relationships that make the difference. This was pointed out actually by a number of different speakers. The relationships have to include, but not stop at the leadership. This includes for First Nations. You really need to connect at the grassroots level, within the communities, within the First Nations, just like LNG Canada has done, as Chief Smith has pointed out. And we need to recognize that it's not one community, it's not one First Nation, it is multiple communities. And Steve very aptly pointed out that we need to connect with folks in the place and in the language that is the one that they use, right? It's a language group, it's a new Canadian, it's an employee, a customer, a municipal council. If you need to go to the PNE to connect with those folks, or on reserve, or where the folks are living, that's what you need to do. There was an interesting aside, and it was a very rich conversation around mental health, and I won't be able to summarize it here, but it really did ask a very fundamental question about the role of business in helping support individuals. And there was a foundational question that I think is important, and it permeates the entire conversation we had this morning. The question around, how are you doing? Right? Not transactional, not seeking compensation or an ask in return, but really trying to understand what it is that people are feeling, what it is that they're aspiring to achieve, and how it is that we're going to be able to address that going forward. And that starts with a foundational understanding of how the person is doing in the moment. And that's about mental health. It's also about impacts on communities and First Nations. And I'll just move on to panel 2 here around meaningful engagement for the shared goal of economic reconciliation, kicked off by Chief Smith. And of course, the Haisla Nation is really a true leader in helping forge a path towards reconciliation, including economic reconciliation. And the chief really elegantly pointed out, and I think this was echoed by Chief Chappell, it's really about a share and a say. In any industrial development that happens in our territory, in your territories, but not only in your territories. And I think Chief Chappell pointed out, it's not only about what happens on reserve, it's what happens in the entire traditional territory, including that which happens off reserve. And it really is about a seat at the table. And here the theme around relationships kept on coming to the fore. And it's not only about the direct relationships with the leadership, it's not only about the direct relationships from nation to nation, it's about all of the adjacent communities, all of the folks that are impacted in the place and how they like to be communicated with. It was very interesting to hear Chief Smith talk about common goals and frankly, what Chief Smith was saying about affording a better future for our people is something that resonates, I think, for every group that's associated with any project. And it's perfectly understandable, but what that opportunity means and what that better life for the future really means for any particular group needs to be understood through their lens. And Chief Harley really made a point around this, and it starts with defining not only the impacts, but actually right up front with the process. Are you taking into account those things that are important to us? And that can include traditional indigenous values, including such things as traditional food sources and impacts on the environment, defined in a way that's important for that nation. So it is about finding creative solutions around balance. I was really quite enthusiastic to hear the bridges that were being expressed by both of the chiefs on the call, and how it was about problem solving in a way that makes sense for everyone concerned, recognizing about constructive solutions that build prosperity and ensuring that all of the groups involved in a project and touched by a project or on whose traditional territory that project occurs has a share and a say. So in conclusion, I'll just wrap up with this. The common theme was one around relationships, and the relationships that are not transactional, that are true, and that have integrity, that are really about understanding without an ask associated with them. They're inclusive, they're unconstrained, they're not influenced. Sometimes they need to be anonymous. They can be obviously facilitated through technology, but it is about reaching out on a one-to-one basis, as a number of you have indicated. And there will be uniqueness to each of the groups, and it's important to understand those and include them. And economic prosperity must be inclusive in order for it to be sustainable. So with that, folks, I think we're working towards defining what the foundation of sustainability is. I'll go back where Dorn started. It is vast, and it is an ongoing conversation, but we truly are fortunate to have the ability to have this conversation with our panelists and with all of you that are participating in this session. And I want to thank our sponsors here for the session. It was Global Container Terminals and all of our panelists. And I want to remind folks before I close off that this is a third in a 5-part series. The next is Thursday, October 7th, where we look more deeply at sustainability and infrastructure. And the focus here is really around climate change. And with that, folks, thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Greg. Thank you to all of the panelists and our sponsors. And with that, I will close it off.